Well, thank you, Secretary Fudge, for those comments, and thank you for everyone who has come here to have this conversation around housing and the pandemic and equity. I am Deidre Asante Muhammad, new Chief of Membership, Policy, and Equity at NCRC. And we are joined, as you can see, by Dr. Andrew Perry, Senior Fellow with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, a scholar in residence at American University, and author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Thank you, Dr. Price, for coming. We are also joined by President and CEO Diane Yentel of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a membership organization dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. Thank you for coming. We are here to discuss Secretary Fudge's remarks in the state of housing and home ownership. Please, everyone watching, share. Please feel free to share your comments concerning Secretary Fudge's remarks and any questions you have for the panel. You too can be part of this conversation. So first, let me go to our panelists and ask, what did they hear from our new Secretary of HUD, Secretary of Housing, Urban and Development, and how do they feel the agenda being outlined speaks to the moments we're in? Let me start with Diane.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I think Secretary Fudge's agenda and her forceful presentation of it is very exciting and much needed. I like how she talks about both the responsibility and the opportunity that we have before us in this moment, because we have this tremendous obligation to ensure that these historic resources that Congress has provided to address housing instability and homelessness during the pandemic are spent well and reach the people who need the funds the most and produce new affordable homes in communities throughout the country. And we have this incredible window of opportunity now in the next 6 to 9 months, really a once in a lifetime opportunity to get the level of investments and resources that we need, both to address housing insecurity and homelessness and to advance racial equity. And so I really appreciate the way Secretary Fudge combines that all together into an ambitious but realistic and attainable agenda.
Well, and before I go to Dr. Perry, let me do one follow up with you, Diane. Is what is the need of affordable housing today, right? Because it's I think it's important to kind of help the audience understand, what is the challenge, what is the depth of the challenge, so we can have a better understanding of whether our current policy framework is well situated to address that need.
Sure. Well, there's a tremendous need. At the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we focus most on the lowest income people, so unhoused people or extremely low income renters. And for them, to understand the housing crisis that we faced during the pandemic, we have to recognize where we were before the pandemic even came to our country, which was in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income renters. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income renter households, there's fewer than 4 apartments that are affordable and available to them. And because we have such a shortage of homes for the lowest income people, before the pandemic, we had about 550,000 people who were unhoused, sleeping in shelters or on sidewalks. And we had about 10 million extremely low income and low income renter households who were paying at least half of their income towards rent each month. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And so when you have such limited income to begin with and you pay so much of it for your home, you're always one financial shock away from missing rent and facing eviction and, in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of those same households, the coronavirus was that financial shock. They lost jobs, they lost hours at work, they lost wages, and it was harder than ever for them to cobble together what they needed to make rent. There were a number of protections and resources put in place during the pandemic that kept many extremely low and low income renters housed, but they fell behind on rent. And latest estimates are that renters owe up to $50 billion in rent and utility arrears. So again, Congress has now provided a combined $46.5 billion to address those arrears. So we have an incredibly important job ahead to get that money to the renters and landlords who need it most. But those funds do little to nothing to address that pervasive shortage of homes for the lowest income people. And that's why we have to also turn our attention to getting sustained and increased investments and program reforms to make homes affordable to the lowest income people.
No, no, I thank you for that. I think you're helping to highlight, there's what is needed to get through an immediate crisis, but how do we address maybe a long-term crisis of lack of affordable housing? And let's get to homeownership now. Let's go to Dr. Perry. What's your feelings about, or what's your analysis of what was stated by uh, Secretary Fudge, and where you hear policy conversations happening now, particularly as it relates to home ownership, and particularly let's focus in on Black home ownership that we know is still about 30 percentage points less than white home ownership.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank the leadership of NCRC and you and for inviting me to the Just Economy Conference. It seems to be very timely. Unfortunately, it's never a bad time to address structural racism, but here we are. I certainly welcome everything Secretary Fudge discussed today. In the main, we have not seen a level of investment to working class people since the New Deal of this magnitude, but certainly since Ronald Reagan took office, when an era of failed trickle down economics took hold. And so, for in the main, this is a welcomed agenda that Secretary Fudge put forth. And I'm just want to highlight just a few things that are critically important. And Diane mentioned this. The lack of affordable housing has been a problem for the decades now. We know it, we feel it, we see it, we experience it in the form of actually the COVID death rates, the intergenerational housing, the lack of jobs with benefits that forced us to go to work when people had to go to their grocery clerk job or driving buses. They put themselves in harm's way, came back home, and infected their family members. This is one of the reasons why, a central reason why, you see death rates in the Black and Brown community 2 to 3 times higher than whites. And housing is central to all of that. And so I welcome this new tax credits, the $20 billion of tax credits to build or to rehabilitate 500,000 single family homes. As you mentioned, um, home ownership is wanting in America. Since the Great Recession, we've took a nosedive in terms of home ownership in this country, and we know that home ownership predicts for so much in this country in terms of education, in terms of health, as I mentioned, and so it's important that we see these kind of interventions. But something else that Secretary Fudge mentioned that we should not overlook: you can never have affordable housing, even if we build new structures, if we don't remove the drags of racism from our various markets, including our housing market. One of the first legislative or decisions that were made, or orders, executive orders that President Biden issued, was on equity. Another was on housing. And those two have to be a central part of the entire agenda, because too often we see discrimination really thwarting any kind of effort in producing quality homes, affordable homes. And so we cannot ignore that employment discrimination, wage discrimination in terms of income, really throttles our ability to create affordable homes. Again, you can't have affordable homes if people can't make ends meet. And so those things go hand in hand. And so for me, I think this is important because if we ever want to increase home ownership in this country, we've got to build more affordable homes. And currently, it's an inventory is a problem. It goes without saying. And even in those areas where we have inventory, the housing stock may be too dilapidated to really for people who should be able to get in those homes for us to see an increase in home ownership. So I think this agenda will boost that inventory, will create more affordable homes. We certainly need other levers at the municipal level, state level to help this along. But overall, this is a welcome agenda that will help everyone. And I just want to say one thing is that I do talk a lot about home ownership, but most importantly, we need stable housing for everyone, consistent housing. Too often, people are pushed around whenever an economic shock occurs. Evictions or are tried. People are moved from place to place. We need protections for everyone, regardless if you're renting or owning. And this is why I think these executive orders to enforce discriminate or enforce our policies on discrimination, because if those don't kick in, we're still not going to benefit from these investments.
Well, in going along with that kind of line of thoughts, I mean, there's one thing about protecting people from discrimination, which I think everyone agrees is an important issue. But then I think you go into also, I don't know if a different direction, but a different issue in your analysis about the need to value homes in Black majority neighborhoods and the problem with devaluing Black assets. So we'd love to hear you talk a little bit. Again, we've acknowledged that, we had to get past racial discrimination, whether it's in lending, whether it's in renting, what have you. But what does it mean to, value homes in Black majority neighborhoods and to, value Black assets?
So often when things go wrong in Black neighborhoods, we blame people. Right when the pandemic set in and we started to see more death in the Black communities, people would say, "Oh, look, that's because of asthma, people not taking care of themselves. They're drinking more, and all these other excuses." The reality is that our communities are devalued and they lack the resources because of racism. My colleagues, Jonathan Rothwell and David Harshbarger, and I did a study not in 2018 where we wanted to look at the overall conditions in Black communities. So we studied home prices and we examined prices of homes in neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. And we compared them to areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And but for this study, we also controlled for all those reasons people say that home values are lower in Black communities. So we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods, equivalent homes to their white counterparts in equivalent social circumstances, are underpriced by 23%, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's a loss of about 156 billion in lost equity. Now that 156 billion is a big number. Know that municipalities use these resources to fund things like education, infrastructure, critical services like policing, but it's also the revenue people use to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. And so that 156 billion would have financed is of the equivalent, I should say, of more than 4 million Black owned businesses based on the average amount Black people use to start up their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million 4-year degrees based on the average cost of a 4-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over.
Mm.
156 billion would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. This is why I say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. Again, when we look at our Black communities, that they are thwarted by negative perceptions, biased policies over time, and current discrimination that we see in that under that devaluation of property. So even when we do own homes, we're not reaping the benefits. We're being robbed of the American dream because of racism.
No, I think that's a really important point, and it's one of my favorite quotes from your book about there's nothing wrong with Black people that solving racism
Ending
won't
racism.
address.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and that's let me go into briefly, and I think you bring up another important point that as someone who studies racial wealth inequality a lot, it's important to note. I mean, I think we recognize that African American home ownership being stuck at around 42% since the time of the 1968 Fair Act is definitely problematic. So we want to increase that Black home ownership, but at the same time, we're recognizing, as is in the report that NCRC put out, 60% Black home ownership, a radical goal for Black wealth development, that African Americans go into greater debt for less valuable homes and receive less of a return on home ownership than whites. And similarly, African Americans will go into greater debt for higher education and oftentimes will have less income than whites of that similar education level. So even when people are taking the quote unquote right models of asset growth, it's still not bridging that inequality. But I want to go to Diane real quick and just ask, oftentimes when we talk about wealth and asset development around housing, we think of homes. But if you could, and Andre already commented on this a bit, but help us get a better understanding of the deep asset that is affordable rentals. That is so important to, and also too, maybe not just to low income, but even, middle income communities.
Sure, and I think also just recognizing it's important to recognize that the racism and the racial disparities that Andre discussed and has shared so well in his research and his writings shows up in who becomes homeless and who becomes an extremely low income renter. So these decades of racist housing policies in our country, purposefully put home ownership out of reach for many Black Americans that created this yawning generational wealth gap that exists today. This then creates tremendous racial disparities in housing and homelessness, where Black and Latino people are disproportionately likely to be renters, to be extremely low income, to be rent burdened, and to experience homelessness. So, for example, Black Americans make up about 13% of the general population. They are 40% of people experiencing homelessness, and they are 50% of homeless families with children. That clearly doesn't happen by accident. That happens by intentional and generational public policy that created these disparate outcomes. And so now we have this tremendous responsibility to use housing policies to reverse this harm done and create equity. And that does come through, for some people, through first-time homeownership, through building wealth through homeownership. For many, too, it comes from having an affordable, accessible, decent place to live, which for many extremely low-income people will be an apartment. But we know that the private market on its own cannot build and maintain apartments that are affordable to extremely low income people because the rent that they can pay doesn't cover the costs to build and operate those apartments. So subsidies are necessary. So we need the federal government to significantly increase subsidies to make homes affordable for the lowest income people, whether by bridging the gap between what people earn and what rent costs when they are already in apartments through expanding the Section 8 voucher program so that it is universally available to all eligible households, and whether it is building more apartments and ensuring that they are affordable to the people who need it the most, the lowest income people, by expanding programs like the National Housing Trust Fund. But advancing anti-racist housing policy and centering racial equity in our work means that we can't only be working towards and talking about the increased investments that we need. That's a huge hill to climb on its own, but it's not enough because we know that the Section 8 voucher program needs improvement so that it works for the Black and brown renters who need it the most. So along with an expansion of Section 8 vouchers, we have to also work towards a national protection against source of income discrimination. And similarly, when we talk about significantly expanding the National Housing Trust Fund, building more apartments that are affordable to lowest income people, that will only be successful if we're also focused in at the state and local level on reducing or eliminating restrictive local zoning that is very often sustaining racist systems and certainly sustaining segregation. It's also inhibiting the supply of any apartments and driving up costs for everybody. And finally, we have to rebalance the power that exists right now and tilts so heavily in favor of landlords and at the expense of renters, and predominantly of Black women renters who are by far most likely to be evicted. So again, in addition to these major investments that we seek, we also have to advance robust renter protections like right to counsel and just cause eviction. And expunging eviction records. It's only when we advance these policy reforms and improvements together with the investments that we'll be able to actually ensure that these are anti-racist programs that serve Black and brown renters who are most harmed by our inequitable by design housing system.
Well, I like how these questions just kind of fly across the screen. So I will start putting forward some of these questions to you all. But I want to just ask one more thing, and then we'll get to the questions that are developing here. Is Andre pointed out that we've been having kind of a regressive policies, not kind of a regressive policy since at least the Reagan era. And Diane, in your writings, you've noted that maybe even since Nixon, there hasn't been, the needed subsidies for affordable rentals. What has been what is the problem that it hasn't just been like when very conservative regimes are in, but whether it's through the Clinton years, the Obama years, we don't seem to be making substantive progress, even over sustained periods of time, in addressing bridging homeownership inequality. I mean, I guess the closest was under Clinton, Black homeownership went from maybe 42 to 49%, but that was about the biggest jump we saw. Or in terms of rentals, is there anything? It seems like there's something very structural in our politics or our economy that's not allowing growth, and it's maintaining this inequality. So just maybe briefly, each of you speak to 20 seconds, 30 seconds on that, and then we'll get to the audience's questions.
Well, I know for me, there's no denial that there's been a transfer for solutions from federal government to private markets. And so certainly Nixon, Reagan embraced the private sector in terms of solving for housing affordability issues. But certainly Clinton embraced sort of an era of sort of neoliberal policies that embraced the market.
Hmm.
And so between them, I think we've seen just a backing away from the federal government's role in that area.
Diane?
I agree, and would add that there are macroeconomic challenges that have existed over the same period of time that the federal government has been cutting back on funding programs that work and having them be publicly owned homes that work for low-income people. At the same time, wages for the lowest income people have remained essentially stagnant and rents have been skyrocketing. So since the 1960s, for the lowest income, lowest wage workers, their wages have increased by only about 5%, and rents have increased by 61% over that same period of time. And now we have this system in our country when it comes to the housing subsidies that are necessary to make homes affordable for lowest income people. We have a system where only one in every 4 households who needs housing assistance and is eligible for it receives any. So we have what is essentially a housing lottery system where only the lucky 25% gets the help that they need. But always it's been a matter of political will. You know, we have long been certainly able as a country to end homelessness and end housing poverty. We have the solutions and we have the data and we have the resources, but we've chosen not to as a country. And I think the good news there is that the political will has been growing, where now we have a president, President Biden, who talks about housing as a human right and who has committed to universal housing vouchers. That's by far further than any president in my lifetime has gone in committing to affordable housing resources. So now our work is about holding him to that commitment.
Yeah, no, that's and your words reminded me of that Dr. King quote about how we have the resources to address poverty. We just don't have the will, and we haven't had the will, and maybe we're making a turning point as it relates to that. I think
Yeah,
Andre, did we trying to jump
yeah.
in?
I just want to just add one brief point to accentuate what Diane said. The reason why this jobs infrastructure bill is so important, not only will it improve infrastructure, lead to investments in housing and other areas, we can also create jobs programs that will give people the kind of wages, skill development that will sustain these investments over time. And so you can't really have a real affordable housing initiative without a jobs program. One will fizzle out without the other. And so for me, it's critically important we get this jobs infrastructure bill done because it will enable regular folks to participate in their own growth and recovery.
No, no, I think that's really helpful. I mean, again, we want housing for everyone, but we also want economic mobility and asset development, not just to house poor people. We want people
Yeah.
to be able to have jobs and develop incomes. One of the questions that was put forward, and it reminds me a lot of what is in the Know Your Price book. The question is, shouldn't we be looking to develop LMI, low to moderate income housing in neighborhoods with resources? And it reminds me of debates I've also seen in the book, One Way Street of Integration by Ed Getz. I think that's the idea that we shouldn't be having, that we should be focusing low to moderate income in higher income neighborhoods versus in lower income neighborhoods. So would love to, for you, Andre, to respond to that. And then would love to hear from you, Diane, about thinking as it relates to particularly low income or lower income rentals and where they should be.
Yeah, my thoughts on that is we somehow have to de-risk this notion that building affordable housing is, again, a risk of some sort. It is truly a risk when we segregate communities, particularly around income. And too often, this not in my backyard sort of movement really puts the rest of the country, the rest of our communities at risk. And so when we're thinking about lending and investing, we need to really shift this notion that what's really putting us at risk is a lack of diversity in our communities in terms of income. You should be able to work and live in the same community. And too often now, people have to travel long distances because they can't afford to work in their areas. I mean, you have in some areas, like in San Francisco, you can be a teacher and can't afford to live in the area. And so that has to shift. And so these efforts are these not my backyard efforts are bolstered when we say that affordable housing is somehow risky. And so we really need a different paradigm when talking about what we need as a country moving forward.
And Diane, what's your thought around that question? Should low to moderate income housing be in more high resourced areas, or should they mostly be in high resourced areas?
So that it's an ongoing, long time debate in the rental housing world about whether we should what we should do to recognize that much of our federal government's investments in building bricks and mortar affordable homes have built them in often segregated, high poverty neighborhoods where people have less access to healthy food and higher performing schools and access to transportation and jobs. And so the question then becomes, if we're going to build more affordable housing, where should it be? And the debate often happens, one, without an agreement that low income renters, predominantly people of color, should have a true choice in living in the places that are best for themselves and their families. Like so many higher income, predominantly white families have that choice. And the way that we make that choice something genuine is by both ensuring that we are creating affordable housing opportunities in neighborhoods that today have those higher performing schools, lower crime rates, access to jobs and transportations, and we are revitalizing communities where affordable housing options already exist. And in those communities, maybe what's not we don't need to build more affordable housing, but we do need to invest in the surrounding neighborhoods. So we've often had that conversation as a housing community, um, in a frame of scarcity. And I think now this opportunity to potentially get far greater investments in the solutions that are needed offers us an opportunity to really expand the way we think about that conversation and the solutions that we advance.
No, no, I think that's real helpful. And also, taking Andre's idea that affordable housing is an asset, right? So I like that idea that in places that have plenty of affordable housing, they need investments in other types of assets. In places that might be high income and don't have much affordable housing, they also are missing an asset. And that is
Right.
affordable housing and a greater diversity in income and community. So I like that idea that we need to kind of have the diversity in assets in all communities. Let me, most of the people here are part of local advocacy organizations, local organizations doing work, community economic development, housing. What role do you think that local groups on the ground can play, should be playing in helping to not just move forward what is coming forth from the Biden administration, but to move it uh, even faster forward and address the issues that we've been noting have been in too many ways stagnant over the last 50 years?
Well, I'll start that. I don't think Biden introduces the um, bold policies without the protests of the summer in 2020.
Hmm.
I don't think he gets elected without the advocates that are listening today. I don't think he even gets in the conversation without local organizations really doing so much work over the last 3, 4 years to get someone else elected. So I say, don't stop doing what you're doing. Just because someone gets in office and even proposes legislation does not mean we have to let the foot off the gas. And so I think Diane and I, our work in increases in profile when people are in the street demanding that our work gets noticed. And so for me, I think I applaud the local groups, what they've been doing over the course, certainly over the last few decades, but certainly over the last few years, they've really pushed this president into a place where he has to deliver for us. And so, but I don't think we should let the foot off the gas. We have got to demand the kinds of proposals that he is currently putting forth.
I'm glad to hear that. It reminds me of, we're talking about the Fair Housing Act that was part of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, and that wouldn't have got passed if it weren't for organizing mass rebellions that happened after Dr. King was killed, and rebellions that were happening in 1967 as well. And we saw that after a few years, and there wasn't continued pressure, that a lot of the positive things that were happening, the promise, as Secretary Fudge talked about, the promise of the Fair Housing Act has never really been met. And hopefully, this is a time we can help move in that direction. Diane, what's your advice to community groups to help move these issues forward?
Well, I really appreciate and agree with everything Andre said, and would echo it, and also say that this really is a once in a generation, probably once in a lifetime opportunity that we have in front of us now. And it's right now. It's these next 6 to 9 months where we are very likely to see a multi-trillion-dollar bill pass Congress and start flowing money to local communities. And we have this opportunity right now to shape how those funds are utilized, what programs are funded, who is served by those resources. And we have to get it right. We have to get it right. For those of us who have been doing this work for years or for decades on working to end homelessness or end housing stability, this is the moment that we have been waiting for. And we have this incredible momentum from, as Andre said, the organizing, the incredible advocacy that's happened throughout the last year. We have a president who has made big, bold, ambitious promises, and we have an opportunity right now to hold him to those promises and achieve some, if not all, of what he promised. So I think I know that people are tired from the last many years, and especially from 2020. And I would just hope that we can still pull together and recognize this moment for what it is and keep up the organizing, keep agitating, keep advocating, and keep urging your members of Congress to pass these transformational funding requests that Chairwoman Maxine Waters is making, that many lead Democrats are making. We really have a chance to make big change in the next few months.
Great. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank both speakers, Diane Yentel of National Income Housing and Andre Perry of Brookings. I also want to thank you, Andre, for showing off those hip hop throw pillows back there, the Tupac and Biggie. Yeah, that's great. I love it. I want to thank the audience for coming and hearing this conversation. Let me just do a few housekeeping notes. I think this is one of the last events of the day. Here are just a few reminders. As each session closes, you want to go back to the agenda to navigate to the next session. Most sessions are being recorded and will be accessible shortly via the agenda in case you missed something and want to catch up. The Just Cafe, as is noted on screen, is open for the next 30 minutes, and it will open again at noon Eastern Time tomorrow. So if you want more time to talk about some of the issues that we've been discussing, please go there. And that is it. We will see you tomorrow, and enjoy your evening. Thanks for being part of this Just Economy conference session.